Across the UK, there are tens of thousands of people consuming cannabis legally with a prescription. Yet, the majority of people who consume the plant, an estimated 3 million people, do so illegally. In this episode, we're going to find out how we got here. At what point did we turn our back on a drug which, in the 18th century, was available in our pharmacies, used by our Queen, and sold by our own government? When and why did we implement the prohibition of cannabis? Not only that, but what has been the impact of this prohibition? And where do we go from here? Should we and can we push back against prohibition? To answer these questions, I've spoken with some of the most highly regarded academics and drug policy advisors in the world. To start off our journey, let's hear from one of my advocacy heroes, the man who was sacked from the government's own advisory council on the misuse of drugs for speaking the truth, Professor David Nutt. I'm your host, Niels, and welcome to Psychoactive Minds.
When Britain took over India, they discovered that cannabis was widely used there. Essentially, they took control. They took over the cannabis market in India. This is in the 1820s. They made Indians grow cannabis, which we then sold to them. And that, plus selling opium to China, was one of the great founding economies of the British Empire. There were people in Britain who were opposed to that. They thought it was immoral. And there were also people in Britain, some doctors, who were interested in why the Indians were so keen on using cannabis. And one of them, Dr. O'Shaughnessy, spent time in India working for the British government, exploring the use of cannabis as a medicine. He came to the conclusion that cannabis was actually a very useful medicine. Britons were perfectly happy using cannabis. Queen Victoria used it. She used it to deal with the pains of childbirth and menstrual pains. It was a medicine in Britain until 1971. However, the rest of the world weren't so keen on it, possibly because it was seen as a British monopoly. Partly it was not popular in other countries because you couldn't manufacture it synthetically. You couldn't modify the active ingredient, which was not known in those days anyway. And when alcohol was brought back into legal use in 1933, they were faced with unemployment. And so very rapidly, their boss, Harry Anslinger, came up with a new problem called cannabis. He renamed it marijuana to associate it with Mexicans, started making claims that it was very damaging. Mexicans were bringing it across the border to destroy the social fabric of America. And cannabis became hugely targeted, as it in many ways was until the turn of this century. Britain held out against it. We were one of the, maybe one of the only countries in the world that actually resisted banning cannabis as a medicine. The Americans said in 1934 that cannabis had no medical value, and the League of Nations agreed with that, even though obviously it had massive medical value. And Brits held out, but in 1971, we think, due to pressure from the US government, we conceded and made it illegal as a medicine as well as a recreational drug. So it's a complicated story of prohibition of other drugs and then cannabis being targeted in order for political gain and employment.
It's interesting to pause for a moment and reflect on how in the 1860s in this very country, cannabis was not only openly sold in pharmacies as a medicine, but we as a country were selling it for profit to other nations. So what changed? Where did it all go wrong? To find out, let's hear from Alex Stevens, a professor of criminology at the University of Sheffield and one of the most knowledgeable academics in the UK on the history of our drugs policy.
So it was a rather reluctant participant, the UK, in the developing international control regime. It became rather less reluctant during the First World War. There was a perceived problem with cocaine being sold by foreign troops. Canadian soldiers were blamed for selling cocaine to women and others in London and to troops who were heading for the trenches. And so that's why the initial prohibition of drugs in the UK, which was done by amending the Defence of the Realm Act in 2016, that's the first element of drug control beyond the limiting of the sale of opium to pharmacists in 1868. And then it was when the League of Nations took over the control regime that had been built into the Treaty of Versailles in 1920, which inherited the previous opium conventions. By signing up to that convention, then the British government committed itself to following the international regimes. And as they became more controlling, so British policy became more controlling. One of the most interesting figures in the history of drug prohibition in the UK is a Home Office civil servant called Sir Malcolm Delavigne, who for decades was the leading figure in developing the prohibition of drugs, including cannabis, not just in the UK but also internationally. So his career stretched from before the First World War and into the late 1930s. And he was one of the people who pushed the idea that drug use is immoral, that it's a criminal issue, that people who use drugs should be treated as criminals. And this was quite influential in the development of drug laws in the UK. But he was always being in an argument with the medical establishment that wanted to keep their own control of these powerful medicines. And so this is part of how UK drug policy has developed as this dance between the Home Office and the Department of Health, between police officers and Home Office civil servants and doctors and treatment professionals, around who's going to be the most influential in terms of what the policy is.
I find this deeply fascinating that the reason cannabis is illegal today is not due to any research or study on its effects, nor due to a health crisis or outbreak of problematic use, but due to geopolitics and one man's moralistic campaign against its use. But there is unfortunately a darker and more sinister side to prohibition too. To cover that, we're going to hear from Steve Rawls, Senior Policy Analyst at Transform think tank, who is on the front line of pushing back against prohibition around the world.
Things like the Opium Convention, that was more to do with geopolitics and global trade. It wasn't really public health motivated or anything else. But it then kind of evolved over the course of the last century, increasingly as forms of, I think, social control. So particularly in the US, certain using populations, people using certain drugs who were part of certain immigrant communities, were targeted using the drug laws. So you had, Mexican Americans were targeted around cannabis, African Americans were targeted around cocaine in particular, Asian Americans around heroin, and they became forms of social control. The governments started using in the 60s and 70s, using drug controls as ways of controlling, dissenting voices. So they were portrayed as a threat to society, as a threat to our health, as a threat to our children and our families. It captured a threat-based narrative where drugs were presented as a threat and politicians then positioned themselves as defending communities and families and good, clean-cut Americans from this sort of threat. And it was very much associated with the other. So anything that wasn't the kind of nuclear Christian family was seen as a threat to the sort of established conservative order and was oppressed. And so and particularly around immigration, and you can see a long history of drug laws being associated with immigration narratives, and there's an awful lot of crossover. But within some of those political narratives, there was always, I think, and it needs to be acknowledged, a legitimate concern amongst public health advocates and medical establishment about problems of addiction and overdose and drug misuse that was problematic to health or to families, or to, those aren't illegitimate concerns. But obviously, as the time passed and the debate has sort of matured, it's very clear that this sort of punitive paradigm hasn't addressed those problems, and has arguably, we would argue, made them worse. In fact, made them far, far worse, and hasn't got rid of drugs, and it hasn't got rid of drug markets. So the call for drug law reform has then emerged from the long-term systemic historic failure of drug prohibition to deliver on its own terms, but also all of the unintended consequences. And they were certainly unintended at the beginning, but increasingly, unintended consequences, if it means imprisoning lots of people that you don't like or you're politically opposed to, they start to become intended consequences.
If we didn't end up with prohibition through scientific research and method, how did we get here? And crucially, what are the harms caused by prohibition? Let's find out.
One of the problems with drug policy in the UK is that it's never really been evidence-based. Going back a long way, it has been driven by a rather sort of toxic cocktail of political cynicism, ideology, misplaced morality, and sort of tough on drugs posturing, not what you would normally associate with social policy or public health interventions, which is, normal scientific method. Writers like Neil Woods, former undercover cop, have made a very eloquent analysis of how drug law enforcement doesn't work in terms of reducing the scale and reach of illegal markets, but it can mutate those markets in ways that increase harm. County Lines, it describes the phenomenon of young people being exploited, effectively as drug couriers for organised crime groups, taking drugs from cities to smaller towns, mostly heroin, cocaine, crack. And that phenomenon resulted essentially from enforcement against adult couriers, because the organised crime groups are like, well, if our guys keep getting arrested, we can just use children, and they're much less suspicious. They're not going to get searched. They're not going to get stopped. They're not going to arouse suspicions of the police. And if they do get caught, they're children, so they're not going to get thrown in jail. And they're cheap. And there's an almost inexhaustible supply of vulnerable young people who we can tempt with a pair of new trainers and a pack of fags and a few tenors to do this work for us, and it leads to all kinds of really horrible exploitation of some of the most vulnerable children in society. So again, this is a manifestation of what is nominally often billed by politicians and some police as a success of enforcement, and actually what it does is make the whole situation worse. And again, prohibition, it doesn't get rid of the problem. It just mutates it in often dangerous and harmful ways.
So I've spent the last 30 years working with and now outside of government trying to develop what you might call rational drug policies. Rational in the sense of policies which actually do more harm than good. And current British drug policies are very similar to those in most other countries and the United Nations, in which they are not evidence-based. And that really came to the fore about 15 years ago now, when we did a very well-known, very detailed assessment of the comparative harms of different drugs using the best technology, which we have still today, called multi-criteria decision analysis. When you do that and you estimate the different harms of drugs, it turns out there are 16 harms of drugs, 9 harms to the user, 7 harms to society. And when you assess a range of different drugs on those 16 criteria of harm, it turns out that in the UK and subsequently studies in Europe, Australia and New Zealand very recently have come to the conclusion that alcohol is the most harmful drug. But beyond that, there is absolutely no relationship whatsoever in the UK drug laws, the UN conventions on drugs, between the harms of drugs and their scores on these proper assessments. So that tells us basically the law is not fit for purpose. It's dishonest. It criminalizes people unnecessarily. And of course, in some countries, people are executed for possessing relatively small amounts of cannabis, which are almost certainly less damaging than equivalent amounts of alcohol.
So, cannabis does not seem to be the most dangerous drug. In fact, according to Professor Nutt, it is alcohol that is more harmful. Not only that, our experts have told us that prohibition is exceptionally damaging to our society. It creates more dangerous and violent crime. It disproportionately impacts certain demographics and has been used as a tool to oppress. And it's not just that. There are more issues and challenges associated with prohibition too. Let's hear from Dr. Helen Beckett Wilson, senior lecturer and researcher in criminology at Liverpool's John Moores University. She will shine some light on how prohibition impacts on education and awareness too.
I think the second that you ban something, you stop a conversation happening about it. So people, when they're thinking about this in terms of their children are not going to talk to them about something that they're taking that has been banned. And I guess, again, the alcohol analogy comes to mind. A child might well talk to their parent and say, I drank too much, and this happened. And then they can have a conversation about how to navigate that drug world. But when a drug's prohibited, you can't have that conversation because you daren't tell your parent, I'm thinking about trying LSD, or I'm thinking about taking an ecstasy, or whatever. You silence those conversations. So just on an individual level, that's the harm that happens as a result of it. But of course, the harms that happen as a result of the illegal market anyway, just in general terms, are vast. And there's a lot of documentation out there. There's a lot of groups of people who are campaigning against prohibition, not because we're all saying, oh, drugs are a great idea, we should all be taking them all the time. But what we're saying is the harm of prohibiting it is actually the thing that's, in some cases, is more dangerous than the drug itself, in terms of what happens to if I'm taking a drug from the street that is coming from somebody for whom my health isn't their first interest, then that's really concerning. Whereas if I can get something on a prescription from a registered pharmacy and know what I'm taking and what strength that drug is, then obviously that's a completely different situation. And that's where the harms of prohibition are most visible for me.
So how do we move forward? We've learned that prohibition exists not because of research of evidence around the dangers of drugs, but due to geopolitics and moralistic campaigning, particularly around cannabis. We've learned that prohibition is exceptionally harmful and continues to cause societal damage wherever it's implemented. This begs the question, what can we do? Can we unshackle ourselves from prohibition in the UK? Can the UK government end prohibition if it really wanted to?
It's never come from the top. We've never seen leadership on drug policy in the UK, even though progress is happening and has happened over the last few decades, certainly in harm reduction. It's never come from the top, never. And in fact, looked at globally, almost all drug law reform is a locally driven, bottom-up process. You never get leadership from the top, or very, very rarely. Certainly not leadership from transnational institutions like the EU or the UN. What they do is they kind of abdicate the political risks to local groups who run those risks and take those political risks. And often, the Cannabis Social Club campaigners in Spain, for example, loads of them ended up in jail. And harm reduction people, harm reduction activists have often ended up in jail in North America. So the risks are taken at a local level and it percolates upwards.
The best way to do it is to take it right out of economics, right out of morals, right out of law, and essentially put it into health. Now, and countries which have taken a health-based approach to drug policy, like the Netherlands and like Portugal, have shown dramatic improvements in drug-related harms compared with countries that have kept the regulation in the arms of the judiciary. So we need to revise the whole UN conventions on drugs based on modern scientific evidence and modern ways of analysing evidence.
Allow me to add some data to what Professor Nutt just said. The Netherlands decriminalised cannabis use in 1976, focusing on harm reduction. Cannabis availability in regulated coffee shops separates these soft drugs from harder drugs. Treatment and harm reduction programs curbed heroin addiction rates, and drug-related deaths remain among the lowest in Europe. Portugal went a step further and decriminalised all drug use in 2001, yielding major health and economic benefits. Drug overdose deaths and HIV infections among users dropped sharply, while treatment access increased as stigma declined, supported by harm reduction programs. Finally, the government shifted resources from enforcement to health, saving costs and reducing incarceration rates.
What we now have is kind of like a natural experiment where all these different models are playing out. All this data is being generated. It's feeding into the policymaking process and the public debate. Generally, I think it's positive because even the worst cannabis legalization regulation models have not been a total disaster. Even the worst ones, it's still better than prohibition, and the sky hasn't fallen. We haven't had drug-crazed zombies driving school buses full of children off the Golden Gate Bridge, or any the sort of nightmare scenarios that were being put around by some of the naysayers really haven't manifested. So there's still a lot to learn, but the amount of data is getting better, and it is informing public debate, generally speaking, in a positive way. But there are some caveats on that and some cautions, and we do need to be careful that the data isn't cherry-picked or transmitted through certain political lenses.
It's clear that the impact of prohibition extends far beyond individual choices. It's a complex web of historical, societal, and political factors. While reform is happening, particularly in the medical cannabis sector, there's still a long way to go. In the rest of this series, we'll be diving into the stories of those whose lives have been transformed by medical cannabis. From patients finding relief from chronic pain to those managing mental health conditions, we'll explore how access to this medicine is not just a change in policy, but a change in quality of life. So stay tuned as we shift away from the harms of prohibition to the hope and possibilities of a future where medical cannabis is part of the solution. It's time for a new conversation, and it starts with understanding the real impact that cannabis has on people's lives around the globe. Thanks for watching Psychoactive Minds. See you next time.